Hi, this is Paul. The following video is a conversation that I'm not a part of. This will only be the second time that I've posted a video on this channel, a video conversation that I haven't been a part of. And I usually do that when I see a video that I think, oh, this would be a good thing to share. Now, it's a video between Michael, who's been on the channel before, and someone this is actually his second conversation with the author of the book, Owen Barfield, Philosophy, Poetry, and Theology. Dr. Michael D. Fuccia. I'm not quite sure how to say his name, but hopefully I'll have a conversation with him coming up. He handled so much of the introduction so well in terms of some of his own story that I thought instead of having to go through it again, I could simply share this conversation here. Both Michaels shared a lot in terms of background, in terms of the kinds of churches they grew up in terms of finding Owen Barfield and finding Owen Barfield helpful in their understanding and growth in the Christian faith. So this Michael that the other Michael is talking to is working at the Martin Institute, which is dedicated to further spiritual formation work and the dedication of Dallas Willard, and he's also a good friend of Ron Dart, who's been on the channel a number of times. So just a little video header to say that's what's coming up. I won't be in the rest of the video, but that's why I'm posting it in my channel. So I hope you find it helpful.
All right, so I'm here today with Dr. Michael DeFuccia. Did I get that right?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Awesome. And I found you via your book, which is all about Owen Barfield. And I guess this is your doctoral thesis
Yes.
that you wrote on
yeah.
him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I'd reached out to you. We've had a few conversations about Barfield and his work and your work rather. And so I just wanted to spend some time chatting with you about some of the questions I have about the book and learn. I feel like Barfield is one of these people he's interesting, but he's kind of poorly understood. And I thought engaging with your work was like the best, clearest writing I've seen on it in terms of how he relates to some really key ideas. So I guess just to start things off, if you could, we already chatted about this, but just how it is that you got on this process where you end up writing a doctoral thesis about Barfield.
Well, yeah, it probably goes back to my master's degree. I come from a sort of low church Pentecostal evangelical background, and I was wrestling with what I suppose at the time would have been a sense of, now I would probably call it something like a very vague term would be dualism, the idea that all around me there seemed to be factions in my theology or my the way in which I understood God and my Christianity seemed to be very, in a sense, aligned with the logic of politics at the time, the logic of, I suppose, the world. But I had a deep sense that if Christianity were real, it should be able to kind of have something to say about that logic, not entirely negate it, but fit within it, and then kind of, as I would later probably term it, maybe out narrate it or bring it up or perfect it. And at the time, I didn't have any language, of course, for any of this, but I suppose the existential sense that I was what I would probably now call a fundamentalist at the time, and then or other term uses like foundationalist. So my God was based on a set of beliefs that I had created, and what I was noticing internally was that this form of kind of pietism led to a kind of despair that on many levels, rationally, of course, it doesn't work, but existentially and spiritually, it wasn't working as well. And I suppose one of the main things that led me to begin to study this kind of, I suppose, dualism is how I would describe it now, and how I felt Christianity had to say more about this, was the actual political ideologies I was seeing at a quite conservative school that I was attending, university, for my master's degree. And that was, I suppose, within me, that at the end of the day, I wasn't able to love, I suppose, in this. If God is love, here I was actually hating the other side. And I didn't like that. And that was kind of the existential moment for me that began this unfolding. But then there came this realization that, oh, the God that I had kind of constructed began to deteriorate at the same time. And this was towards the end of my master's degree. So I was sort of like, oh, this is what happens to every seminary student. This is what they warned me about, that I would lose my faith. And it certainly was a moment of crisis for me. And it was at that time that I came across the work of a guy named John Milbank. Someone had given me an article that he'd written in Modern Theology years ago called Postmodern Critical Augustinianism. And I sensed that this was a way forward for me that offered a more nuanced perspective that wasn't throwing kind of the baby out with the bathwater. It was a want for truth, but a mystical truth almost, a truth that was only found in God, and a discourse that sort of really said something about the sign of the times, but also was, to me, far more articulate and placed Christianity in a space that, could have conversations with, the secular discourses and things like this, honor what was honorable about them, and then kind of show how Christianity had something to say in all these different spheres. And so John's work was very pivotal in that. And it gave me a sense of, oh, okay, there's people thinking through these things that in ways that were far beyond my capacity, even today. And then I just sort of, contacted John and started a dialogue with him and met him at Georgetown University. The next thing I know, my wife and I are over in England doing the PhD. And it was about 8 months into that, I had a deep sense, again, that went all the way back to when this started to unfold, that the reality of the world, the things of this world, the things that we see, the things that we do, the disciplines that we're involved in, the vocations we take on, should all kind of point back to God in some way, in a real way. But I had grown up in this kind of dualism where you're kind of sacred secular. And what I wanted to do, I suppose, with John was explore that idea of what does it mean to see God within all things? Because this was entirely new to me as a sort of low church Protestant. It was entirely new. God was either inside of me or he was at church. And this was this very robust vision that I'm still continuing to learn. So as I say, about 8 months into that, it was very clear that I didn't have the educational background to do the sort of thing that I wanted to do with John. And at that moment, he said, well, a lot of the things that you're exploring has been taken up by Owen Barfield. And imagine this is 8 months into my PhD. I feel like I'm being baptized into a world of Anglican Catholic thought that was entirely new to me, very exciting. But had a interlocutor like John, who's far exceeds me still to this day. There's an infinite qualitative difference, I always joke, between John and I that will never be passed. But he was able to see, and one of his students named Adrian Paps was writing something like I would have liked to have written, but I still to this day couldn't write that. And it came out more recently. It's called, I think it's called the Metaphysics, the Creation of Hierarchy. I think Erdman's published it. It's a brilliant book. I cite it in my own work because it's been so influential. But to focus on Barfield, whom I've never heard of at the time, was obviously a shift, but nonetheless was giving me a project that I could do for a PhD that I was hopefully intellectually capable of tackling. Although Barfield is not easy. Not easy to pin down because he's in so many areas. So that's what it was. And then, of course, this idea of participation, which was integral to John's work, and then really integral to the entire patristic tradition that I'd never heard of until I went overseas to do a PhD, that all things were kind of participating in God, and that nothing is outside of God, and God is sustaining all things. This is a very robust God to me. And of course, Barfield doesn't quite mean that when he uses the term, but nonetheless, he is kind of a segue, I suppose, into this more theologically rich tradition is kind of how I've read him described him in my book, I think.
Okay. And so you mentioned there that, your engagement with John's work, that crystallized something in you that started you down this path.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more broadly to, what, say, I guess he's kind of sort of credited with the founding of the radical orthodoxy movement.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
speak a little bit more broadly about like what that is and how that fits into this kind of change in your direction of thought?
Yeah, I get asked that question all the time. And I mean, of course, radical orthodoxy involves a lot. It dialogues with so many different disciplines, and there's a lot of books out there, and it's quite dense material. Usually people are overwhelmed. And I hear a lot of people kind of having different readings of it that don't seem to jive with the way I understand it. I think at its core, what John is or was trying to do, and then the people that kind of caught this ethos, like myself, was that it follows in what's called the Catholic ressourcement tradition, which was trying to retrieve the riches of the early church as a way of understanding as the sign of the times, or it was a critique of modern kind of thought. In if I just go back to the idea of dualism, although it's kind of an over abused term, but the idea that there was a way, reality was much more complex than the separation of nature and supernature, nature and grace. And so John's work was always trying to get at the nuance or almost Christological relationship between the natural and the supernatural, which he sees as kind of pervading everything. But how that works out is similar to what you and I were talking about last time we talked. I think fundamental to that ethos is a paradoxical, or you might say analogical worldview. Now that's a big word. So what does that mean? It's a way of trying, however difficult it is to articulate God. It's both a language and a metaphysic for an account of reality. So it's not a language separated from reality, but believing that language accords with reality, that reality itself is analogical, and therefore the language best are meant to articulate reality should be something analogical. And that's why I think for me, poetry becomes more a metaphor in Barfield's stuff, becomes a bit more, it's like it raises our discourse in a way that into a kind of realm in which we're, whatever language you want to use, raptured or receive the world rather than dictating it. But how that works out theologically, in most spheres, as you and I talked about, you get this idea of God being utterly separate from his creation. And that's true. That's absolutely the case. God is beyond being, all of that. But yet at the same time, Christianity has always held to the very fact that God is in us and God sustains the creation. So how is it that we articulate that difference, yet that nearness to us? And so in the theological philosophical world, you can talk of that in terms of God's being univocal to ours in some sort of sameness, even though he might be much greater than us, or equivocal to us. So we might use language that when I say the word father, that means that God is in no way related to my own earthly father. To say univocal would be to say when I say father, it would be similar to saying that, yes, in some real way, when I talk of my dad, there is a reference to God that I can draw from. So how is it that we articulate, and how is it the relation between God and creation? In Protestantism, with Karl Barth, and you see a kind of rupture there. And in his dialogue with people like Balthasar, in his pushback against something like natural theology, was a deep concern that if you didn't articulate that utter separation, the infinite qualitative difference, as Barth would use drawing from Kierkegaard, then somehow you were making God an idol. Anytime we talked of God, vestiges of God within creation, we might be moving in towards an idolatry. So analogy in that form of doing metaphysics, talking of truth analogically rather than on the one hand univocally, or on the other hand, equivocally, where there's no correspondence,
Mm-hmm.
goes all the way down. And for John, that's a kind of Trinitarian metaphysics. So unity and difference. So it's a paradoxical way. And this can frustrate people because you want to have a kind of really clear vision of who God is on one hand. And then in the postmodern period, there's an anxiety about saying anything about truth or anything. And everything is sort of subjective. So what John was doing, I suppose, in the RO ethos was doing was giving a real powerful, strong kind of mode of truth or a metaphysic that was quite forceful, yet it was mystical at the same time. It was admitting to the fact that we can't fully articulate this, so we need to use a sort of language that can truly articulate the difference between God and creation, and yet his nearness to it. So on the one hand, avoiding a strong deism where God is distant and intervene, kind of interventionist God, and then as opposed to something like pantheism, that we're all God. So
Yeah.
holding the tension between those. And I think most of us see within the patristic tradition holding those in tension in the language. So yeah, and then that goes down to things like dualism, where spirit and matter, particularly in Barfield, are not sundered. It's just a perception we have today.
Yeah.
But they're
Right.
much more integrally tied together, and that's what he means by participation. And so as you might see, this then begin to collapse the idea of secularism, which in John's narrative or his genealogy, he said this has to do with bad theology that happens in the Middle Ages, that you get the idea of secularism, a space outside of God. And without going into detail about all that, I hope that kind of encapsulates where this all fits.
Well, one of the things that we talked about previously was one of the consequences of this sort of fundamentalism that you and I both kind of share in terms of our background, is that it leads paradoxically to a very small God in some sense, which is interesting, because if you take the text of the Bible literally, all the propositions are there to create this large God, but then you have a conscious experience of something that's much smaller and is, as you said, confined to this very specific set of spaces, that are quote unquote, religious or sacred, versus encompassing the whole world. I mean, in running through all this stuff, have you come to any conclusions about how that happens? That this, you have these propositional statements about a God that's so wonderful, magnificent, etc., but then it's so disconnected from your everyday experience of the world.
That's a really good question, and I wouldn't want to, allow my own experience to cloud that of other people, or how that unfolds with people. But a lot of the spiritual contemplative writers, when they're talking about spirituality, for instance, Teresa of Avila, when she talks in the interior castle of the kind of different rooms or moments or stages into the life of God and into union with God, the third stage tends to be the place that at least she and the contemplatives would talk of as a place we don't normally move beyond. And that tends to be that moment in which we're acting for God, we're doing for God, we're trying to construct this kind of like vision of God. We're trying to grasp things and have it very clear. And somewhere between the third and the fifth stage, or the third and the fourth stage, most contemplatives who have this kind of hierarchy of, and you have to be careful talking of hierarchy, because it's a letting go of the self, right, in the ego and all of this, to use a more contemporary term. But in that sort of space of surrender and going, oops, you know what, like I thought I was climbing this ladder of sophistication or knowledge of God and all that. It's very clear that to them, between it kind of at that middle stage of spirituality where one comes closer into union with God, there is this crucial moment that one kind of realizes, like, all of their activities and doings for God up to this point have not fallen short, but led to this place of a sort of mystical experience where to move forward into this is a kind of undoing of everything one knows and an unlearning. Nicholas of Cusa talks of theology as like a learned ignorance, and I'm very Platonic in that way too. Like the one who really doesn't know knows something. And so reaching that kind of point, I think one either gets scared and retreats, I think, because I did that for a long time. It's very scary to reach that threshold.
Yeah.
It can compromise relationships. It can cause one to have to leave a certain church environment or feel at least very out of place. And so I would now, reflecting back at my own journey, see that as pivotal in the life of journey into God, I suppose. And I think in the language of contemplatives, one doesn't normally, it's quite rare for someone to pass over that.
Mm-hmm.
By no means am I claiming I have. I'm sort of still in that space where it's like, okay, finding God is not so easy to grasp. It's more of a letting go. And it's funny because a lot of my book talks of active and passive, and only now is this becoming a spiritual thing for me. But in the same vein, the spiritual or contemplative tradition talks about moving from an active spirituality in doing things to one of passivity later in the later stages of just simply receiving, in not imposing our own understandings upon God or even upon others. And so there's this tension between knowing and not knowing that I wasn't very comfortable with early on in my spirituality. And I'm finding that it's in those moments of unknowing that I grow closer to God, if that answers the question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Partly what it made me think of, and I'm trying to connect a lot of different things together, so I may do this poorly, but there's a sense of getting to that place of not knowing. It's a sort of fundamental state of humility, and a sort of recognition of that, that infinite qualitative difference you're talking about between us and God. And is it in John's work that he talks about, like, all this, the moment of revelation is always is sort of in the act of worship, right? Like that there's and there's something about this sort of humility and and having to come into some sort of I don't know, a sort of overwhelming sense of how far short your conceptions of God are, so that you can actually see something real instead of being blinded by your own ideas about who he is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I wouldn't want to speak specifically for John, but I think this is his draw to theurgy, which is the idea that one is kind of raptured. I've seen the word used by a favorite theologian of mine named D.C. Schindler.
Yeah, I was going to bring him up. His surprised by truth, and
yes, exactly. The language he uses is Balthazar uses, I think, is rupture. And so yes, exactly. So it's not that all of these thinkers, I think most within the kind of RO sphere, I wouldn't say David Schindler he's just a proper Catholic great theologian. Although he dialogues with John and these figures a lot. They have this idea that when you, that reason kind of reaches an end, and in that moment of grace, or however one would want, I'm sure it's articulated differently, but the difference is that reason is perfected by faith, not done away with. And this is something Thomas Aquinas says that a lot of them want to draw upon. And so whereas a lot of the tradition I came from was when God's revelation comes, it has no relationship whatsoever to our ability to accord or rationalize or think. It just kind of utterly, in a lot of religious traditions, that is the case. But what a lot of these figures would want to say is that faith, or this revelatory moment, is truly a rupture of our reason, but yet on the other side of it, it perfects our reason. It brings us up to a knowledge that we didn't have before, but it's more of an internal kind of knowing, or a felt sense of, and when I teach this, I always tell my students the very existential or spiritual point of this is, oftentimes when we're wrestling with God, it's because we have this kind of like odd paradigm. And so we can't make sense of things. But when that moment comes, whatever it looks like for anybody, whether it's ecstatic or just kind of an aha moment, I think we tend to go, oh God, here's the problem. I thought you were this way, but
Mm.
actually, this is who you really are. And so it's this deeper understanding of God that on the one hand undoes what we knew, but gives us a real truth that we cling to, I suppose. And so again, here's this paradox between unlearning something, and in the very moment of unlearning, we're learning. And so I think that's probably roughly what David Schindler is getting at too. His book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, is as good as it gets along these lines. I think it's called Impure Reason or Pure Reason. Anyway, I always mix it up, but it's a brilliant book.
Yeah. Have you seen his talk? I can't. It's on YouTube somewhere where he's talking about how philosophy begins and ends in wonder.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to keep in mind too. And I think this is linked also to not Schindler's work isn't, but theoretically it's kind of linked to the Catherine Pickstock's work, in that that liturgy is kind of the consummation of philosophy. It begins and then ends in this sort of, like you say, worshipful expression. I think the way we think of philosophy today is very different than it was for the ancients, and I
Sure.
hope for the Christian tradition that it was in a sense of wonder. And I think one of David Hart's works, I think it's the more accessible, the one about just being consciousness and bliss. I can't think of it. The experience of God. I think he spells this out quite well, that you that philosophy nowadays tends to ask the question of what something is, not why something is. In other words, it's forgotten to wonder at the mystery of existence itself. Again, the fundamental question is why there's something rather than nothing, and then going from there, not presuming there's something, but why there is something. And that, I think, is the question of wonder. That's a real
Yeah.
question of wonder, that begins, at least in the Platonic discourses, of kind of an unfolding. But also in Plato, this is always in concert with the divine. And this then feeds into kind of the Christian ethos, I think, early on, that like wonder and in that the exploration of truth or of God was something of an unfolding wonder. And there was never a moment in which one ceased. In fact, to do that would be idolatry, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So if I was going to summarize your book really quickly, I would kind of say that what you're trying to do is articulate this sort of poetic philosophy of Barfield's, but then go a step further and try and look at like what are the ontological significances of this way of viewing reality. Would you agree with that, or clarify that in
Yeah.
any way?
Yeah. I think, I'm still learning about Barfield, and I wouldn't claim that the book is in any way definitive, because there's so much there. I think because of the theological world in which I inhabited when I was writing this, I wanted to, it's very obvious, people that would know that world would say, oh, he's trying to draw Barfield into that orbit. So yes, I was. But to me, that theological discussion right now was kind of, I suppose, on the cutting edge of where the history of kind of human thought was, and then to bring Barfield into that sphere and say, what does he have to offer this, and what is lacking? I suppose in the 5th chapter, I'm trying to get out what is lacking in his work. But yeah, I suppose I try to paint him as someone who never passes through the modern Enlightenment period, who's pushing back on that. His entire life, he never, in that in how that comes to be, I don't really know, but you find within the tradition, and again, Adrian Papp's work does really well at kind of linking this kind of lineage that never falls prey to the kind of rationalism that comes to define our times even
Hmm.
today. I
He
mean,
engages with Barfield in his work as well.
I doubt it, but he's
Yeah.
more, I don't think he does it all. He might have a footnote, but
Yeah.
it's very rich philosophical, theologically located in the philosophical and theological traditions of the West. And he kind of traces this what we might call a tradition that never kind of falls prey to that. And so Barfield, for me, did seem this, and I think even his tensions with Lewis, if one could call it that, had a lot to do with, at least early on, Lewis's high rationalism. And Barfield never went down that path. So that's why I think he had something unique to offer, as eccentric as he can be at times. Yeah.
Right. So I have a little quote here that kind of, I think, from the book that delineates Barfield's trying. You're trying to lay out how Barfield kind of has this idea of the bridge between the objective and subjective within this poetic philosophy. And the quote is, "This inspired poetic utterance allows the subject to exceed the strictures of a pure philosophy, precisely because the subject is not a ground in him or herself, not purely active or passive, but is situated in a medial realm through which he or she paradoxically receives from the divine in the act of naming or speaking or naming." And I'm curious, could you speak a little bit more to, like, what this sort of medial space? Because I think it's this, again, it's about, it links back into Coleridge and the polarity and all that, but it seems that this seems to be the core of what Barfield's trying to accomplish in all his works. But he's always trying to come up with different examples, different things to try and force you to accept that this is a reality, this middle space that we actually live in.
Yeah, I think you're exactly spot on. I think that is a good summary. I'm not saying the quote you read, but what you're saying. This seems to be the key to I think, to understanding Barfield. And I think you picked one of the most dense quotes in the book. That must be towards the end, I think, or no?
No, this is actually I think this is actually your introduction. Yeah, I just found this one recently.
Wow. So what? So I should probably start with the middle voice. So in Catherine Pickstock's work, who was very influential in pointing me in this direction long before I'd even, knew what that meant. We don't have a middle voice verb in our language. We don't use it. In fact, I think only in maybe Norwegian language, I can't remember right now, contemporary language, do they use the middle voice. So there's been postmodern, like Gadamer, and I know Gadamer has looked at it, but there's been a little exploration of the middle voice. And so to place it in contemporary modes, like if you think of the modern period, the humans sort of rise up, and we start naming things on our own. We no longer listen to things. We say, well, we should use that tree for paper, or something like that. So in other words, we start imposing our will. This is a Nietzschean kind of narrative, but nonetheless, I think most people would agree with this. We start actively kind of imposing our will. So we become very active. And then after Nietzsche, this idea of the will to power terrifies most of us, because we go, oh, maybe he's on to something. So now what? Well, then the phenomenological tradition which emerges out of this, and this is why I use Heidegger as an example in the work, is this utter passivity now. So it's like, ooh, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to hurt anything. We've ruined everything. So I should say nothing about anything. And in fact, the truest poetry, the truest art, the truest is totally subjectivity. It has no meaning whatsoever. It crosses over into this abyss. So on the one hand, this very forceful truthfulness, objectivity, and in postmodernity, again, I'm simplifying this a great deal, so I'm going to get in trouble for doing this, but I try to spell this out in the book. Is postmodernity is kind of founded on this idea of the passive subject. And what's interesting is that even in Greek, obviously, there's a middle voice. And so the middle voice is not only situated somewhere between this receiving and saying something real about things, but what is unique about the middle voice, and I think it's in the last chapter, I just spend a little bit of time on this, but it's Catherine Pickstock who pointed me to this. There's an article by a guy named Jan Gonda written years ago that when he's studying the middle voice, particularly in Greek, it always has this kind of theurgic element to it. So it's on the one hand a receiving of the world. It's on another hand an articulating of what it is, but that is kind of only done in participation with the gods. So I'm kind of stretching this. So it says something, the middle voice not only kind of suspends these two things in a real way, but it also has something to do with a connection to the divine as well. And so in Catherine's work, she takes up this in her after writing, and that's the first time I'd ever heard about it. But in Barfield's work, which of course jumped out to me, is when he looks at the word phenomenon, and I can't remember, I think it's in Saving the Appearances. He translates it in the middle voice. And so this is very interesting to me, of course, because then it ties in with this idea that we're neither active nor passive, but it fits exactly as you say with Coleridge trying to work out at the time this objective subjective thing, particularly in Romanticism, was really important because we didn't want to see nature as purely objective and then the mind as purely subjective. They wanted to see nature living and in a sense subjectivity in the world, a participatory world view in which when we're actually seeing things, we're saying something real about the thing. It's not just qualitative over quantitative or mind over matter, but mind and matter are everywhere suspended and held together. So the middle voice had both to do with a way of articulating this space between modernity and postmodernity, but also an almost theurgical or in some maybe a Christian way. And one of the things that Catherine had mentioned, and this is very much the case in spirituality, Paul's language, and I could be wrong on this, and I don't want to misquote her, but Paul often talks of prayer using the middle voice. So it's like Christ praying through us, right? The Psalms, that's what the Psalms are. And so this makes, to me, years later, as I'm studying more into contemplative spirituality, it's even more exciting. It's like, here we are, this active, passive element within spirituality, which we all recognize. We all go, oh no, God did that. I didn't have anything to do with that. Like, if we're really pious, like, right. Oh no, it's all God. And then the other end of that is like, no, I did that. Yes, I was empowered by God, but I've worked my way up the ladder and I'm holier than thou. And so it's always somewhere. This active passive thing was, and so I think the middle voice, although we don't have it in our language, it's interesting to think on those terms. So again, that's a long answer, but I hope it helps to make sense.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because it's like, we got to spill a lot of language to try and describe this thing that we don't have. Because as you pointed out, it's like both in the modern and in the postmodern discourse, there is this sort of either orness. It's like, you got to go this way or that way. Like there's this, the polarity that Barfield's trying to articulate, I do think kind of looks beyond modernism and postmodernism to say, okay, no, you have to recover this sort of wholeness. Yeah. Because, even within the postmodern frame today, that I feel like has definitely dominated the academy and the social sciences and humanities and such. There's a weird sort of rationality in there as well. It's very tight. It's very simplistic. It doesn't even while they are, and this is when I was growing up, my parents sent me to like camps and things to try and prepare me not to be indoctrinated by postmodernism. Of course, the thing they say is like, okay, postmodernity's claim is that there is no truth, but that they're claiming that is an absolute truth. So that there's this sort of, which you do find in the work. If you boil it all down, like you always end up in that same dichotomy. So, anyway, I'm wondering, did you find anything in Barfield that was helpful for you personally in terms of escaping that sort of like either or, that kind of helped you in terms of your conscious view of reality see, okay, there's a way I can stitch these things together and they can coexist?
That's a good question. I think in terms of my own life, while Barfield might have given some kind of like rational, I don't, or super rational explanations of these things, I don't think any of that change in vision happens by an intellectual
Yeah,
pursuit.
I agree.
I think it introduces I think it held me captive. I think in a good way. In other words, at least there was something out there because let's face it, if I was a fundamentalist, I was already a rationalist. So here was a form of intellect that allowed space for mystery, and so that was intriguing to me in and of itself. But how that goes from still really a construct or an abstract principle to becoming a habit of life or a way of perception, that is not a question that I feel qualified to answer,
Yeah.
although I would think it has something to do with, as a Christian, with prayer,
Yeah.
in liturgy. And I don't think we attend to that enough. I certainly don't. So to answer your question, I'm still a fundamentalist, and I'm still a rationalist, and I still see things in dualistic, but I can tell you why I shouldn't do that. And I can
Yeah.
tell you
Yeah.
why it's actually incoherence. It's utterly incoherence. And I can have those conversations. But the slow unfolding of that within me, and I suppose some people probably find that differently. Maybe it's the other way. Maybe it's a spiritual thing first, and then a sort of, but hopefully one day all these will somewhat be integrated in me, but it's just a slow unfolding. I don't know if that's what the kind of question you're asking, or if I'm
Yeah,
answering
well,
it right.
I as soon as I said it, I realized, I'm kind of in the same boat as you. Like, I do find Barfield's very helpful for framing the problem and making you see that the incoherence.
Yeah,
But in terms of like, what's the solution forward? What's the path to his quote unquote final participation? That's always kind of
yeah,
open ended, because he's spilling so much ink just trying to get people to see what he's talking about,
yeah.
that I don't know that it's unclear what he perceives as a path forward to kind of to move, to change consciousness. That's a real difficult thing. I sent you an email last night where this just occurred to me about Jonathan Pajot's work. He's this Eastern Orthodox icon carver, and he's gotten fairly popular. He was actually somehow his popularity came about because he was friends with Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
And but he's coming at it from such a different perspective, and in this sort of symbolic perspective, I feel like is a way of trying to explicitly give you propositional statements that help you see the way these sort of patterns play themselves out everywhere in reality, at every layer of reality. That this sort of his quote is, symbolism happens. It's this coming together between heaven and earth. Like there is the materialism that, as I mentioned, like I'm still a materialist in some like fundamental ways that it's hard for me to shake. And yet it's like, as you said, it's incoherent because there's these invisible realities that are driving everything. And so I think what Jonathan's doing is trying to show, he's trying to kind of educate your consciousness to see these everywhere. A lot of what he does is he goes into really old stories, like very old fairy tales, and shows here's how these things reflected another reality. Like, oh yeah, it's a good story and that's why it survived, but it's communicating something larger about the structure of reality. And so, like, for me, like, I can talk about how, Jesus is the logos and this is like the fundamental structure of everything, but I don't have a toolkit to kind of experience that in terms of how I see things laying out. I go back into my my other, quote unquote smart ways of thinking about things that I think, I'm smart and I'm gonna power through this with some rationalism and get the right answer. But yeah, so I what's funny is I always find insights coming in his work, but I haven't found a way to internalize that perspective. It always sounds like he's coming at things and he sees something real, and I'm like, but I don't understand how he's doing what he's doing. Like, I'm like, what
Yeah.
is this perspective that you have?
Yeah, I agree. I think the wrestling with how one gets that vision to go all the way down is a lifetime of learning and of growth, I suppose. Or but I think what you said, iconography, for instance, is certainly a way that a lot would say the Eastern Church avoided. The kind of idolatry, the irony that the icons are the very thing that suspend idolatry,
Yeah.
because we learn to see through them, right? And so again, here's this paradoxical tension that in getting rid of icons, all of a sudden everything becomes an idol,
Yeah.
rather than learning to see through them to God. So I think art, that kind of art, is one way. I think increasingly I have a friend who is really on to this Irish poet named David White. I don't know if you've heard his name, but
I've
he
not.
is phenomenal. And
Is
so
he still alive?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
and he's become kind of like I don't know, really popular now. I think he's done a TED talk, but his poetry is so deep, and there's something about that language that doesn't fully articulate what we know to be true.
Hmm.
I think that helps me, I suppose, have those moments of real transformation. I think where this vision continually deepens. My friend who loves David White is himself a good poet. He he'll often like call me or say, "Hey, I've just written this." Like I'm not a poet. I wish I could be, and I'm too rationalist, I think. But the most recent poem he read to me, which I don't remember much of it all, but it just talked about he's just become a new dad, and the relationship between father and son. But one of the things in my response that I think hit me so powerfully about it was that it could be read on so many levels. The metaphor that he's talking about could be about relationship with God in me. It could be read about myself, and I don't have a child, but if I had a child, or a father and a son, but also about me and my truer self, or however one wants to articulate that, or myself in God. And what struck me about the way that hit me, in the sense of God's nearness to me in that moment, had much to do, I think, with the fact that I could not rationally take his analogy or his metaphor and go, "Oh, he's talking about a father and son. Boom, I'm
Hmm.
done. I can move
Hmm.
on." It was that it had like this holographic kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
vision that I couldn't quite pin down, and it was that very thing, because I couldn't rationalize it, that it made the most sense to me. I suppose someone who's rationalist or a logician listening to this conversation would be vomiting right about now. But I'm talking about a kind of internal knowing that is much deeper and situates us within the world, within the people around us,
Right.
that really grounds us, and to me makes me feel that God is very near to me. And for me,
Right.
this is the Christian God in
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah. It's
But
like
for others, yeah, it may not be.
it's interesting. It's like it's yeah, it's like, yeah, that internal knowing that you have to consider yourself smart in the modern frame, you have to dismiss, right? Or at least you got to put it very low in your hierarchy of how you make decisions, how you explain yourself, um, etc. To and what's funny is, like, we've gotten very, very good at pretending to be objective, I think. Because obviously, again, if we were really objective, like, not nothing, nothing, you couldn't explain anything we do from an objective, quote, rationalist point of view. And so, but we've gotten very good, because there's so much status connected to it, pretending that, oh yeah, I'm being objective here. And I find myself doing that a lot as well. And so it is hard to make those movements away from it until these sort of I do find for myself it is often through art, stories, movies, things where like something about that allows me to get outside of myself and see that there's something really deep here that is present all the time that I'm overlooking, that I'm just walking right past, even though it's there next to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think I might have mentioned this in our last conversation that in reading books right now on spiritual direction, they say a lot of the people who are kind of at this point where they desire spiritual direction and deeper union with God are those kind of on the fringes or the outskirts of
Yeah.
the church.
Yeah.
So I think people who are at this, I would say, like third stage of spirituality, like we've wrestled with ourselves, I think, is actually to encourage them to explore in those areas where they're finding meaning. Because inevitably, I think with proper guidance and with the right, encouragement, that's going to lead one back. It certainly did to me, back to God.
Yeah.
Through the mystery. At some point, I think, we need to try to walk away from that construct that we've created. But I also, objectivity can be very good as well. There are very good things about it. So the sciences have done absolutely incredible things with an empiricist method.
Yeah.
And so that thing, I want to be clear about that science has done incredible things. Engineering, the things that we've done, there's so many beautiful things that have come out of this, so many lives saved, lives changed, all good things. I think the only thing I would want to avoid is assuming that method of or technique becomes that method for looking at things, objectivity or empiricism. My only angst is when that becomes a metaphysic, a description of all of reality. So as long as one is clear that that's there's a certain time for objectivity and it does a certain thing, then yes. Because if that's the only vision, then like you say, it doesn't accord for the human side of us at all. It's hard to talk even of humans at all. And that's why the humanities, I think in general, because we're over kind of emphasis because all the money's in the science, the humanities suffer. And in a sense, we suffer as a result of that. And I think Barfield was on about this sort of thing too.
I'm curious, do you feel like technology itself is morally neutral, or do you think it has this sort of some sort of bent in it that almost always leads it,
Yeah, I suppose it's like anything. I mean, techne, I go all the way back to Aristotle. I think we talked about this last time.
Your chapter 4 was all about the difference between divine and human making.
Yeah,
and Barfield's perspective was kind of like, hey, like we're almost necessarily going down this path going to destroy the world.
Yeah. Barfield is quite cynical about it. The Inklings, you kind of wonder with the Industrial Revolution. Tolkien seems certainly concerned about it. Yeah. I think a lot of people post-60s were concerned about it. I think there's a lot of people who still are. I mean, even in the most basic level, like we kind of know that we're being watched by our iPhones, and we wish we could get rid of them, but we can't. But techne, I think, it's always been human making, right? Since Aristotle defines physis and then techne. So physis is nature, the word we use for nature today, which is a kind of like natural making. Like the most natural thing I can do is make a baby. There's nothing more profound than that. And I think as long as we remember our techne, our human artifice is distinct and will never be as I suppose self-moved is what Aristotle would describe physis. Like a baby is self-moved in a way that no other thing a human can make artificially could ever do. As long as we are understanding that distinction, I think technology should move along. I think it's when you get a confusion that when we think that the things we make are an escape from nature, or we've kind of like done something better than nature, that's when we get ourselves in trouble. And that's why I will always point to the Aristotelian distinction between physis and techne, which, yeah, you're right. I do that in chapter 4. Although I'm reminded that when I did my defense, Catherine Pickstock was my outside reader. And she was very, very concerned about how she kind of looked at me like, you've been reading too much Barfield. You sound very cynical about technology. And I was just kind of like, oh, that's not what everyone should be thinking. And
Yeah.
she, because it was just, that's what all I was reading for the past
Yeah.
like three or 4 years. And so that's how I suppose, 6 years later, I would say, technology, like for instance, in COVID, we couldn't communicate this way. This is a great gift, I think.
Yeah.
It can be used towards a good end. But does this replace you and I sitting down and having a coffee together? No way. And
No.
anyone would say that. But
Right.
it's sufficient. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I find myself going back and forth too. Like I would say at points in the past I had a sort of naive optimism about technology. I work in tech, so that's partially why. But then I go back the other way where I'm like I see it as only kind of necessarily going bad, because one of the things that I do see that, and I think even Pajot says this, he equates technology to kind of like these sort of dead layers that we kind of put on ourselves, and one of the consequences I see of that is it produces a sort of complexity that if it isn't well managed, it gets out of control. Like it becomes kind of this part of our culture, and because again, as you pointed out, there's so much money attached to it now too, that it really it definitely has a life of its own. That if we don't if we aren't diligent with it, in which a lot of times I feel like we're getting less and less diligent with how critical we are in our approach to it, then it definitely has this kind of ability to kind of run off the rails really quickly. So yeah, I kind of go back and forth on that, because my thinking is that, if technology is the problem, a lot of the solution is going to have to come through some sort of technical element as well. Like, when I think about like the big companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google, the ways in which they are using technology, it's a sort of view of the future where I think their ideal future is like these sort of AIs that have figured out humans so completely that they can just pull our strings like puppets. That would be, and I don't think anybody would articulate that statement, but it's incrementally where their vision of the future is leading them towards.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about this I have friends that are quite involved in like conspiracy theory stuff about big tech, which I was completely unaware of, and I don't think much about it that often. To go back, I think, to the question of the moral neutrality of it, Heidegger thought that it was an epoch. He just called it, like it was this kind of way of seeing that emerged in the modern period, a way of viewing reality and therefore treating it a certain way, taking things and making them towards a certain end. And then you get like in a student, I don't know if you know the names, Hans Jonas, I think. Yeah, Hans Jonas, Hanjonas, was a student of Heidegger's, who said, no, it's not morally neutral. And he wrote a lot of books on describing these, not necessarily why it's not morally neutral, but that it has a certain bent that in some ways has removed morality from the picture. So in other words, if you take an empiricist kind of technological stance about things, and then you end up reading that in 1 second, I need to open my door.
Oh, no worries.
Sorry, I had to let my dog out.
That's okay.
If you end up reading that vision into all things, again, taking a methodology and making it can appear quite sinister, actually, because to do the sorts of things I have to do, on the one hand, with what we call, like, Graham Ward calls this, I think he's the one that calls it, like, the transmigration of the good. So you have to take, so the good, the true, and the beautiful are no longer fixed, like in a sacramental vision, and it has to move and migrate from one thing to another. And this is what drives our desires. And so who does this the best? Mac, as far as I know. Well, people stand in line forever to get the new iPhone because that's the new good, and the old one, like,
Yeah.
literally falls apart. And the best way to do this is going to a thrift store. Like, they're just stacked with, like, old technology that's completely useless because the good has migrated and moved on. And in technocratic stuff, you can do that, but in the natural, that's not how things, that doesn't change. But if that's read then back into humans, then that's where it starts to become quite troubling, I think. And so upholding this kind of thing in which things are fixed, they're sacramental, they have essences, real essences, and ends towards which they should be used. That's one thing. And so as long as our making isn't compromising that, and then obviously a lot of what drives our society today has to do with kind of taking our desires, which are meant to good, our desires to consume, that can be a very good thing, and turning it into, like, oh, this is the new thing, and it's all based on, kind of like you say, money and selling. And so one today, if you're involved using technology, if you're using, say, social media, you have to be a pretty virtuous person to be able to handle all of that pool,
Yeah.
all of that draw. And because I'm not virtuous enough, that's why I don't have social media. I've recognized it as, like, wow, I'm not holy enough to live in this space by any means. Like,
Yeah.
I have enough trouble with, like, a daily life of prayer and trying to connect with God. Like, that, adding that to it is just, like, I don't know how. And I'm sure there are people that do it just fine, do it really well. But yeah. And so for me, it's just kind of like, wow. And again, that technology isn't necessarily sinister.
Yeah.
It can be, but yeah.
Yeah. It's I think it's gonna feature heavily in whatever happens next here.
Yeah.
I have a sort of longish quote I wanted to read from your conclusion and get you to react to it. So bear with me here real quickly. So this is from the final chapter. If Barfield's theory of the evolution of consciousness is at all tenable, then perhaps this poetic aesthetic never truly died. It may even perhaps make a conscious return. Indeed, its vestiges live on not only in one's subconscious, as Barfield would have it, but also in a tradition that Barfield himself largely ignored. In fact, this poetic aesthetic is becoming increasingly tenable as the search for truth, albeit speculatively, commences in the wake of postmodernity. In light of this, in the context in which it emerged, and in the contemporary discussion regarding the relationship between philosophy and theology, Barfield's poetic philosophy is significant because it turns philosophy away from an imminent trajectory and back towards its fulfillment in theological transcendence. For it will be argued that only a theological language is capable of expressing philosophy's limits while paradoxically gesturing beyond them, navigating between a totalizing grasp of being and relativism. This worshipful utterance, conceived as a perpetual finite grasping of the infinite, is the only possibility of becoming, i.e., forward movement. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that, and like why Barfield shows us that maybe even unintentionally that we need theological language to really move forward in terms of our philosophical understandings?
Yeah, I probably would change the forcefulness of that quote now that I'm years out. That sounds a lot like a Milbankian way of saying things, quite direct. I think that what Barfield has to offer is this real question. He really pushes the bounds of eminence. The idea that everything that we know and learn is in the here and now, and it's not received, or it doesn't come from, fundamentally, if you're a Christian, you would say the transcendent God.
Hmm.
And so in all of Barfield's work, there's kind of this dimension, you might say, that you might call sacramental, but the idea that when we're going about things, when we're perceiving things, when we're talking about truth, when whatever it is we're doing, there's something quote unquote more than meets the eye going on there.
Hmm.
And when I say he's kind of gesturing towards this theological vision, that's what I mean by that. He doesn't really, maybe later in life he gets more on this, um, but he doesn't ever come out and say, "Oh, this is." He's not as forceful as like a theologian might be, but at the same time, in a post-truth era, people don't want that sort of forcefulness. Like they don't. They're very anxious about a forcefulness of truthfulness, of talking in terms of like, no, like that statement I just made, like the only way forward. The notion of way forward. What I was kind of playing on is the idea of progress. Like we're so caught up in the idea of progress right now, and it's kind of like, what do you mean by progression? But I suppose I'm talking about humans in our humanness, our human nature progressing, not so much in an evolutionary, like we become bigger and stronger, but perceiving things perhaps as they are. If I think a lot of people would say we've regressed, depending on what and if we were to make some kind of progress or return, as the language of someone like maybe Lewis or Barfield would use, then it would involve this kind of divine dimension, because on the one hand, our attempts to secure things failed us miserably, but we're also just not utterly passive recipients. So this idea that of Tolkien's as being, this is all inkling stuff, of being sub-creators, like finding that middle space where we're doing the will of God, I think is something we've really ignored. How that relates to, say, even public discourse today, well, something I'm involved in right now is really asking the question is like, what does Christianity have to offer our time? Like in a real way. Like you
Hmm.
look out and there's political upheaval that we haven't seen in my time, and with COVID and all this, in the protests. What does it have to offer? It's kind of like, well, something that keeps emerging for me when I ask that question, and you brought this up earlier, is it offers humility. It offers, I don't have answers, and I don't need this, but it offers some type of vision of unknowing, actually, of saying like, well, I don't have all the answers. Like, I don't know the truth. I
Yeah.
don't know. And in that is kind of that's kind of transformative, I think. And so this kind of ability to be a passive surrender and not see ourselves as the end all be all of things, that there's something bigger, greater that can speak to us. If that is the case, then it would be good to attend to that, whatever that looks like. I mean, to me, it's prayer, prayer.
Yeah.
And so, and then allow that to shape us in a transformative way, I suppose. I'm getting much further than I'm trying to right now than I would be saying in the book. Um, in the book, what I'm just trying to articulate is that postmodernity is very clear that modernity failed,
Yeah.
and it's rightfully so. Its critique of that kind of logic
Yeah.
is very, very profound and needed to be done. It needed to be undone.
Yeah.
But now, is it just merely a critical? Is it just really a critique? How do you build moving forward? Because that's kind of what I'm suggesting. Like, how do you build in a post-truth era would be something like, I think, one in which we look beyond eminence. Because if there's one thing that these two spheres have in common, it is that they absorb transcendence into eminence, or that things are just as they are here, take it or leave it. Either we're utterly wrong about them, or we can know everything about them. And
Yeah.
there seems to be something more mysterious again there. And this is why this kind of idea early on of what John Milbank was trying, in following the ressourcement tradition, trying to retrieve the riches of the church. Can you still hear me? Is it still
Yeah.
working?
Yeah.
Okay, it said I was signed out, but trying to retrieve this earlier vision where transcendence and eminence are constantly held in tension,
Yep.
the nature and supernature. It seemed the retrieval of that in a new way was vitally important to me, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. Like, so one of the things that, one of the tensions that came to mind while you're talking about all that, in terms of like, what does Christianity have to offer? One of the things that I feel like a tension that is consistently come up when I'm reading Barfield is this sort of like the role that like God's sovereignty and our free will play,
Oh,
and how these
okay.
play
Yeah.
out. And I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on what Barfield has to say that? And I do think at times reading Barfield, I come away feeling like sort of maybe even overwhelmed with my own responsibility to kind of help everything course correct, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's similar to what you and I were talking about. That is a real point of critique against
Hmm.
Barfield. I think you're very astute pointing that out. On the one hand, Barfield seems to think that the evolution of consciousness is just kind of unfolding out of our
Yeah.
hands, and is, being following Rudolf Steiner, he kind of gets this idea that history is kind of just unfolding and that this is going to happen. But then on the other hand, so there's, if you think of it in terms of God, although I don't think Barfield uses the term of God's sovereignty, he wouldn't really speak that way. One of the things that's cool about Barfield, he's always just looking at how things are or how they've
Yeah.
been. He's not supposing like God is going to do something, or he's just looking at things as they are,
Yeah.
which I really appreciate, because you can learn a lot about God just by attending to reality, like we've been talking about. But he seems to say, on the other hand, that the imagination, this is crucial to him, which we could talk about, is that he sees the imagination as integral, or a training of the imagination, which he gets from Steiner, but he also gets this from Coleridge, that this link, the imagination, has something to do with moving us, like you say, into this next sphere. So into this next epoch, or however one wants to describe it, of what, like you say, final participation. What does that look like? All that, I don't really know. I mean, we
Yeah.
can guess. He didn't really fully articulate it, but yeah, so how much of a role do we play in that? Like, what is my role in all this? I think it is, I suppose, if I'm I mean, he wasn't that close to the Inklings, but the Inklings would, of course, say, we do play a real role. And oh, by the way, God is sovereign. So it's,
Yeah.
again, this
Yeah.
very paradoxical, it's the Christian vision, of aligning the will with God's will. One becomes most free. That doesn't sound like it makes any sense to us today, but it's kind of internal freedom. Plane is going over right now. Speaking of technology, but it's a kind of internal freedom that one has in following the will of God. It doesn't make any sense today. That sounds constricting. It sounds like prison. But yeah, I think in his work, that's never really worked out. I think you're spot on to kind of point that out. And yeah, the role we play in that, for him, certainly, there's no doubt that we play a role in that. And that role has to do with the training of the imagination, because the imagination exceeded reason for him. It brought reason up to its it perfected reason kind of for him.
Yeah.
And he gets this from all the romantics.
Yeah. I think, was it Coleridge that said imagination is reason in her
Reason,
highest
yep.
mood?
In her, most exalted or highest mood. Yep, exactly. Yeah. So this is coming from all this. So how do we move beyond to the truths that we can't quite articulate? Well, you should use poetry. Another quote, I think it's Coleridge, who says, prose is the best words this way. Then he says something that,
the prose is the words in the best order.
Yeah.
Poetry is the best words in the best order.
Beautiful. Yes. So it's the same kind of thing. So if we're going to articulate this, we should use poetry for these sorts of things. And so, yeah. And that for Barfield had to do with a training of the imagination to see differently. That would bring in this new post kind of like alpha thinking period where we're dominative kind of like, but unlike the postmoderns, Barfield believed you were really grasping something true. He wasn't throwing truth out or metaphysics out. He had a very robust metaphysics. So his account of poetry and even the middle voice is very different than you get in, like, I think it's Derrida who reads the middle voice as self-reflexive, as if saying like you're talking about yourself. But for him, no. For Barfield, this is something you're receiving. I joke, like when Austin Powers says, allow myself to introduce myself. That's kind of the postmodern view of middle voice. Whereas for Barfield, it's much more, so it's still subjective, if that makes sense. But for Barfield, it's something more than that. And so,
right. I think that is something that strikes me about reading Barfield, that maybe you kind of imbibe a sort of spirit of his confidence in that what he's engaging with is real.
Yeah. I don't know where he gets that confidence, but I wish I had that kind of confidence. He does. He's one of those people that stands in that lineage who's very clear, like, this vision that I've been bequeathed to me and my Oxford education is a bunch of nonsense. Like, you're all off. In fact, this guy named Rudolf Steiner is much more onto something than you, which would have been absolutely appalling in that time.
Yeah.
But I also think his link to language was so far ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And he followed again in this kind of counter-enlightenment tradition. In this link to language was crucial, particularly in the critiques of Kant as well, which he's quite critical of. Whether Barfield was aware of them or not, he knew to use language as a starting point, which only now people seem to be catching on to.
I don't know if you picked up on this, but I remember in Saving the Appearance, one of the things I found really interesting was because, like, it's really unclear. You mentioned he never says anything like God's sovereignty, right? He doesn't have a kind of God perspective on things.
No, he's not talking theologically at all.
But he notes that, this sort of U-shape to going from original participation to whatever, like, extreme thing we're approaching now, where we're getting it so far away from it that we almost can't even remember it, or we can't, it sounds nonsensical, like, to talk about it, or as soon as it's brought up, it's like, okay, well, that's clear nonsense. That's what primitive people think. But he makes the point in terms of the history of the Jews, that it almost seems like God pushes them down that track of away from original participation, where all the people around them are all worshiping the sun and moon and stars, and they're engaging with those spiritual realities. And it's like, no, you won't do this. You have to not do this. And then, and in a certain sense, you could say, anybody that's a Jew today is like a long kind of, it's almost like a Darwinian selection process. If you've stayed in it, you really held to that, because, starting with the first exile and being, thrown out of their own land, going to Babylon, and the fact that they retained an identity and that their God, was still real, even when because at that time, I guess, in other books I've read, like, there was such a connection to your physical space you were in. And so if you left the land, it's like, well, your God lost. He's not real. Like he was overthrown by the other people that conquered you, their God. But the Jews have a completely different narrative, which is they go on the exile and they're like, no, actually God did this to us because we weren't obeying him.
Wow.
He used your armies to like, so they, and it's just amazing to me, like, you know, even if you didn't believe in a sort of transcendent God that was working through history, like you'd have to look at the Jews and be like, what is so unique about their perspective that they survived, you know, like what other Iron Age religions are around today?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so it's, I don't know, something's going on there. So and it seems like God is working something out in that, even though there is also this sort of negative consequences to this U shape where we get so far away that we're out of balance. But I don't know if that struck you at all, or if you thought about what is the good part of this, right? This sort of, because it as you pointed out too, like even the Enlightenment and all this empirical science, it has enabled a different understanding of the world that in some sense is good. It's enabled us to do things that are pretty impressive. There's some good in that, but it's like it's we've become kind of so one-eyed in terms of how we can see things that we forgot to integrate it.
Yeah, that's all really important and insightful as well. That question of what's going on there with the Jews, as Barfield takes us up in Saving the Appearances, and then, you know, how does that relate today to what we're seeing? I think for Barfield, and then in his history of consciousness, the way he sees things, I think something to that kind of one could kind of locate the centrality or the question of what is the evolution of consciousness with the idea of idolatry, which is what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
you worship the creature rather than the creator. And so this was happening to the Jews, and Barfield kind of puts this within this history of the evolution of consciousness. I think for the listeners, the idea of the evolution of consciousness goes something like this for Barfield. Like you mentioned this, in the past, if we look at primitives, they seem to think all things were kind of sacred. There's this constant intermingling, a word Barfield used, constant participation between spiritual things and material things, and you can never sunder them. You talked about the U shape. All of a sudden in the modern period, I'm glossing over this very quickly, what we get now is this complete separation of those two. I go to church on Sunday, I go to work during the week. That's the really Christian cheesy way of saying it. But like, there are times when I encounter God, but most of the time when I go out fishing or I'm just walking around, God is nowhere to be found. In prayer, he shows up again. He kind of comes and goes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of like modern sort of framework that Barfield doesn't like. He thinks that this is an aesthetic way of viewing things that isn't like fitting with the contours of reality, kind of like you said. But then he hopes, or he seems to think in final participation, this high rationalism that we developed would again marry this kind of romantic vision of things living in a unique way, but in what way specific that is. And so, yeah, the question then of idolatry becomes very important because it has to do with how we see things. And again, here's this participatory vision of things that he sees in like primitives and in like the earlier periods. He's quite critical of Aristotle. I think he begins to see this vision he wrote in Aristotle. I
Yeah.
wouldn't agree with him, but
Well, I think maybe more specifically Aristotle's followers kind of.
Yeah. And so this idea of categorizing things, like you said, you brought up holism, like sundering things and starting to split things apart, comes full term in someone like Descartes, where you see the Cartesian dualism that we beat over the head all the time today, if you're kind of interested in Barfield and this sort of thing. But yeah, so the question of idolatry, like, how are we looking at things? Are we seizing them as things in themselves? That's idolatry. Forgetting that they're gifts. That gift is fundamental to a Christian vision of the world. So the moment we start to see things as ours, you see this in Lewis all the time, is seizing things as knowing and having control. This is a danger. This is idolatry. Mine, precious, Gollum, all this stuff.
Yeah.
This is exactly what all the Inklings are after. So yes, of course, God says, no, you shouldn't do that. You've forgotten about me. I'm going to take you on a journey, a pilgrimage, so to speak, so you can learn who I really am. And that unfolds, of course, over history. And of course, there's a million ways to read that. I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not an expert in Jewish or Hebrew literature or anything by a stretch of the imagination. But the point is, like, yeah, that's not the right way to see things. And so I'm going to show you how to see things. And yet we kind of go on this phase of idolatry that for Barfield kind of represents the modern period of the seizing of things, the calculating of things, a kind of forgetfulness of their givenness, the mystery of like things just kind of appearing. They're just there. I'm here. We forget these sort of it's a kind of a phenomenological reduction to materiality, or however one wants to call it, rather than letting things kind of be. And so the proper mode, again, all the way back to what you said at the beginning of iconography, is learning to see things as gifts from the creator rather than givens, I suppose. So if we grasp reality as a gift, it changes the way that we treat things. It changes the way that we our way of being, the way we use things. We should obviously think of humans that way. The prime example again is a child. We've really done nothing. People got together, but aside from that, the creation of a child, I mean, I can't imagine. I'm not a father, but everyone who is says this is the most like amazing gift to be given. And a much more significant, and this is again back to the technology thing. If Amazon drops a package off at my house, I don't think much of it. But if someone goes out of their way that knows me, and even something as simple as a grandmother making something for us, there's something about that gift that we're going to have much more respect for. I can't order another blanket off Amazon that my grandmother gave me. So there's something about that givenness, not givenness, but that it is a gift. I'm going to treat it and view it with a sacredness that I wouldn't had it if I saw it as a given and replaceable. Yeah. And that's really the difference between a human kind of gift, a natural gifting, and a technological kind of gifting. It's irreplaceable. And so I think idolatry is the moment that we think things are replaceable, or they are reduced to just their bare kind of existence. Like, I can replace that part in my car, just get another one. It's not the end of the world. It's just some money. The other example I use with students is my wedding ring. Like, I can replace this ring. It probably costs $400. I don't know. It's white gold. I hope it's white gold, not aluminum. You never know. But I can replace this, no doubt. But I'm always going to know it wasn't the one that my wife gave me on my wedding day. That there's something very significant. And this is techne, but there's something significant about that because it's tied into the person who made it. And so that's kind of, I think, the proper perspective that the Christian, I think, that Barfield is onto when we go about our day, when we see people, when we see the world, to see it as a gift from God. And so therefore, because it's a gift, I shouldn't use that blanket from my grandmother, to change the oil in my car when it gets older. I'm not going to do that with that blanket. I'm going to care for it. There's a certain end towards which it should be used. And I think that's what idolatry fails to do, is attend to that end, I suppose. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting that kind of jumped out to me too is, this contrast in my mind between like sort of a deistic model, where in that model, God gives us the gift, but then it's like he completely goes away.
Yes. Yeah.
Versus
it's like a bad father. Like, he sends you stuff on Christmas, but it has no meaning because he just ordered it on Amazon.
Yeah. Or even in my mode of thinking, sometimes, and I've even had kind of a sort of like negative thought or experience of this is that like, well, we're just an experiment, you know, and maybe there's a billion of them, you know, running, and we're just like one of the ones he checks in on every now and then and see, oh, did they do anything interesting today? You know, like what's going on in experiment, you know?
Yeah.
And so versus a sort of unfolding of reality that is bespoke and a gift for us specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of transjective mode that we talk about between the objective and the subjective, the middle voice, is it's pointing towards God's participation in creation as well, like that his movement towards us that is specific and directed towards our view of the world, our consciousness, our what's salient and important to us now, and speaking and intersecting through that.
Mm-hmm.
Versus, you know, just like, oh, here's some stuff, go figure out, see what you can do with it, see if you can go make some iPhones.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I've never thought of deism along those terms. Of course, distant God, but as an experiment, yeah, like it's not really relational, is it? It's kind of a come and go, or even a transactional kind of relationship, as opposed to something I'm learning about right now is that all of creation is really an intimation of an unconditional love,
Mm-hmm.
like in a desire to be with us, in a drawing of us to that love.
Yeah.
That's very different of a God. In Christ, obviously, a God who comes to be in fleshed with us in an intimate way, then shines forth through all things and is drawing all things to himself, ultimately in the vision of unconditional love on the cross, that is kind of reflected in the vestiges of creation. To see things that way requires for me a lot of, I suppose, healing of past dogmas, past understandings of God as after retribution, as angry, as that will take, I suppose, a lifetime for me to make sense of. And so that's still not, I can talk about that, but like we were talking about earlier, having that go all the way down, that's a different question.
Definitely. And well, I mean, for me, like, I feel like this is where both the incarnation and the cross become really important as evidence against that we're an experiment, right? Because you know, even in Jesus and his humanity is not a sort of temporary identification. His identity with humanity is permanent. Like it's there in the theological end of things as well. And the marriage between, you know, the church and Christ, which Paul references as this kind of sort of great mystery. And so for me, that's really comforting as a sort of like, okay, this is so, you know, in Jesus, one of the things he always says throughout the Gospels over and over again is like, I can only do what I see the Father doing. So his ministry, his life, and his death is all a sort of revelation of who the Father is, right?
Yeah.
And that's his intent. And they're like, oh, you know, show us the Father. And he's like, don't you understand that everything I'm doing now is an icon of the Father?
Yeah.
That's even what you know, I think Paul in Colossians calls him the icon, the firstborn. You know, he's the incorruptible image of who God is. And so for me, I think one of the things that I don't know if Barfield triggered this in me, or even it was even prior to that, but it makes me ask certain questions about what does God's involvement in creation, what does it cost him? What does he of himself is, because you know God's infinite, and you know, but his voluntary coming into relationship with the finite, and this sort of working out of things over these long time spans. Like what is that what does that cost of him? Because I do think something of the cross is intended to illuminate God's, because I don't, the model of love is a sort of giving up of oneself to another. And so I don't know. I'm just, that to me, like, really struck me as, because again, my model of God was this sort of thing that created us and had opinions about us, but was very far off in some sense, not versus this model in Barfield where it's like he's like anytime I'm perceiving truth, I'm doing that in God, so to speak, or so there's something of God that's making it accessible to me in an actual movement of and disclosure of himself.
Yeah, I think the self offering or self emptying, or however one wants to articulate that, is both like, and a real metaphysical thing that occurs. I mean, one of my supervisors described the incarnation both as historical, like he put a picture of the cross, drew a picture of the cross, but then had underneath it a timeline from like origin to end. And he kind of said the incarnation is something like this, so it spans all of history, the lamb slain before the foundations of the world. So on the one hand, this is a real historical event. And on the other, yet the world's been caught up in Christ since the beginning. Right. And so John says this, but and so therefore, like in a real sense, that pivotal moment on the cross becomes on the one hand, the existential reality of unconditional love that is able to absorb all sin, all our shortcomings, all of the things that should make us unlovable, right? Like all the things that would offend any one of our relationships, all the things we've done in secret and been exposed, or that is all absolved in that moment. David Hart paints this really well, that up until that point, like, we didn't have a conceptualization of that. The gods had to be appeased in some way. And here is this kind of ultimate sacrifice where God comes in the flesh and says, no more. That says something about unconditional love, that the sacrifices have ended. And we, in the Eucharist, remind ourselves of that gift over and over again, of that ultimate sacrifice. And it somehow, that becomes the real bread of life. Like you say, it becomes there's a reason the church is called the body of Christ. I think living that out and then understanding that in its fullness of what it is, I'll never do. I mean, but there's a real sense in which that moment is transformative, but yet already kind of began at the creation, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, I guess from my perspective, it's important to me that the cross isn't a one-off, because on the scale of creation, God comes to earth, dies on a cross. I mean, relatively speaking, that's kind of like for us, that's like a night in a bad hotel. I feel like I stole that from somebody, right? It sucked, but you already knew it. You already knew everything was going to work out at the beginning. So I'm back to my real life now.
Yeah.
Which I don't think that's what the cross is intended to be. There's some sort of cosmic underpinning of creation itself that is being illuminated specifically in that life and death.
I think you're exactly right. I think in terms of thinking like, what did God have to give up on that? Or I think we often get caught up on that side of it, but it's more about an expression of what God wants for us, because we're never going to know what the other side of it, why like. God did it that way or whatever. I mean, it is what it is. But to see it as what does it mean for us? I think that it is easy to get caught up on that question of like, what did that mean for God? What did he sacrifice? Did something change in God? Did, when God took on human flesh, did something change? And these are real questions to be asked. But I think the bigger question is like, what did it actually mean for us?
Mm-hmm.
That's a harder, that's the sort of, I suppose, spiritual question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to, I know we're getting close to the end of our time, and I wanted to go through that. You had a few really interesting quotes that you lead off your final chapter with, from Chesterton, Balthasar, and Kierkegaard. And I just wanted to go through those three and get you to respond to why you chose those and how they relate to kind of your conclusion. So the first one from Chesterton is: the poet only asks to get his head into the heavens, is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head, and it's his head that splits.
Yeah. So Chesterton is so witty and brilliant. That is one. I don't know where I found that quote, but I thought it was really, really great. It's kind of like that's what most theologians do, right? That's what my job is supposed to be, is to bring, I suppose, to wrap my head around heaven or something, rather than, it being the other way around. It's sort of, it points to that, the thing of humility, I think, that we've been talking about. And it's a reminder, I think, as a theologian, that if I'm a theologian, I aspire to be, has something to do with the learned ignorance. Nicholas of Cusa uses that. I think in a lot of disciplines, there is real growth to be had in knowledge, right? So in the sciences, or if I'm a biologist, there is real growth. And it's not to say that in theology that's not the case, but transformation of the self, that's a different story. That has to do with learned ignorance. That's kind of the thing, goes all the way back to what we were talking about, like humility. So that's why that quote, I liked that quote. Yeah.
Awesome. So the next one's from Balthasar, and this he talks about dialogicians then are philosophers who themselves need theology in order to develop their thoughts to completion.
Yeah, that, to me, I don't know what context is in, so I don't want to take it out of context, but to me that kind of points to not just, we're all dialogicians, right? We're all logicians in some way. Dialectic, we're trying to sort things out. Like you say, you and I are both always going to kind of revert back to that. Now, am I saying that we should all be theologians, that theology would solve all the world's problems? No, in fact, most theology I read is just repeating this same thing. It's dialogicians. I suppose what I think of is that I suppose you should place theology with God would probably be a better way, the way that I'm thinking that through. Like at some point, like we talked about that idea of rupture, that brings us beyond our rational capacities, yet is in a sense very meaningful and rational at the same time. So that's how I think in terms of that.
Okay. And then the last one is from Kierkegaard. I found this is really interesting because you use the phrase non-identical repetition quite a bit in the book. The quote goes like this: modern philosophy makes no movement. As a rule, it makes only commotion. And if it makes any movement at all, it is always within immanence. Whereas repetition is and remains a transcendence.
Yeah, that idea of non-identical repetition is, I've been working on a paper for a while on that. I mean, literally like for like 4 years, and that by 4 years, I mean, I haven't gotten back to it in 4 years. But that idea of non-identical repetition is something that John Milbank and kind of a lot of the people in the RO ethos really cue into as a paradoxical way of talking about movement, or the relationship between history and eternal truths, the relationship between form and matter. And so the critique there, that Kierkegaard's scathing critique of kind of Hegel and Kant, and you can see this in his the idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical in Fear and Trembling, the Night of Faith stuff, is that Kierkegaard, and why this is so appealing to someone like John, is this paradoxical notion is how can you have non-identical repetition of something? And so for me, that's actually an account of all of reality. An idea that it's Platonic, but to me it's also Christian, and it has something to do with the stability in flux of the world. So in other words, like everything is constantly changing, but yet at the same time things are very fixed, and we seem to be able to. So this is an account of reality that Kierkegaard had that then John picks up on, and I think it's quite necessary to have. It's a paradoxical notion that, you can just use a human, for example. We all know, if we talk to scientists, they would tell us, like, you and I change so much, like our skin falls off, our mind changes. Let's think, we develop, we grow bigger, we change our hair color. All these things are changing, yet our identity is very fixed. Like when I come to talk to you again, I know you're Michael, and that's a very basic example, but even trees, for instance, the reason that we can recognize them through their change is because they are yet identical, yet repeated instantiation. So the reason I'm able to call an oak tree and not a sunflower is because it is a kind of non-identical repetition of an oak tree. It's identical to other oak trees, but it's not. It repeats that same essence, but yet it's unique. And so all of the world is kind of a non-identical repetition. And when Kierkegaard's talking about movement, he's saying you can't even recognize change unless there's both stability that carries through that change, or form that carries through the change in matter, if that makes sense. And so this is what Kierkegaard was critiquing. On the one hand, Hegel's notion of history as unfolding and constantly changing, but then he was critiquing Kant for trying to get at these ideals and these transcendental kind of like fixities that one could know, kind of universal truths. And so he's suspending those two by saying, no, movement at all, or the way things are, is actually non-identical repetition of kind of like eternal truth. And so this, to me, feeds into how we understand the relationship between history and dogma, how we reinterpret things within the Christian tradition within our time. It seems to be the tension between liberalism and conservatism, utter change versus no change. And it seems like so much of the world seems to be caught up in this dualism between the two. And then Kierkegaard saying, no, change and unchange state are fixed in all of creation, if that makes sense. There's much more philosophy behind it too, but to me, it's just kind of a vision of reality of what's called non-identical repetition, that everything we look at shares and participates in a particular unity, a repetition of the sameness, but it's non-identical from the other one. So that's what
it's sort of an articulation of the many and the one.
That's exactly what it is. It is a Platonic concept of the one and the many, and how it is that a universal can be caught up in so many instantiations of a particular. And it's by that universal that we recognize things. Like it's by that repetition, that sameness, that we identify things as they are, and by which we can be confident in our knowing of things. This is why Barfield said that, like, once you lose that, this is in his critique of Kant, like once you lose the idea that these essences or things are within, they're within things, this kind of sacramental vision as a Christian might describe it, then he says the road is open to the madhouse. Like, because if those things are not fixed, stable within change, then yeah, we ought to give up on all this altogether, but it just doesn't seem to be the case. we're still identifying things, we're still having conversations, we still seem to be able to make sense of people. So clearly there are things that are fixed that we're able to grasp, yet they exceed our grasp. And that's kind of a Platonic Christian Barfieldian vision of things, I think.
Awesome. Well, I know we're getting right at the end here. I was curious, is there anything that you would like to plug here at the end? I know you're currently engaged working with the Martin Institute.
Yeah. I don't have any need to plug anything.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to plug, but yeah, the
Gotcha.
Martin Institute is kind of dedicated to spiritual formation. It's at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. And it's kind of dedicated to the life and work of Dallas Willard in getting that message out of that formation and transformation in Christ is a real thing that people can. We're not just kind of sitting around waiting until that day, but that can be had now. The kingdom is real and something we can participate in now. And then it's kind of developing more broadly in other spheres. And so, yeah, I'm excited about what we're doing there. And I don't have anything else really exciting going on in my life.
You mentioned there was a conference next year that might be
Yeah.
being rescheduled.
Yeah, we're not quite sure about that yet because of COVID, but yeah,
Sure.
it looks like it's going to be a smaller symposium just to make sure we're safe. But I'll get back with you if and when we hope to produce content from it, so to share with others. But yeah,
Gotcha.
it's kind of a questioning, what does Christianity or formation have to offer our culture today? Does it have anything to offer, or is it just an internal thing that we do?
Yeah.
And so is Christianity just this thing inside us, or is it something that really is transformative? I tend to think it is transformative, but how it is we go about doing that is much more challenging to articulate.
Gotcha. And you, at one point you'd mentioned something called the Methexis Institute.
Oh yeah, so
is
the
that still a
Methexis
thing?
Institute, yes, it is. It's what John Milbank is I suppose the word would be principal of the Center of Theology and Philosophy, which is based in England. That is a political, philosophical, theological, sociological, all things you can involve yourself in, think tank. And there was a sense in which that needed to be translated because even if you have a PhD, even I will struggle, even working with John for all these years, I'll be like, can you repeat that again? Can you, what was that name you just said? Like, I've never heard of that person. It is an attempt to articulate these things in a more common language. And so in was it March or May of last year, we had our first conference in Charlottesville. That's what Methexis means, participation, by the way. There was a sense in which, how do you get people to understand the very vision that you and I are articulating?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose the best way of summarizing that would be it's an Inklings kind of endeavor, in a sense in which, like, yeah, the whole world is very much alive with God. And we need to get out of the silo kind of mentality that God only exists in the church or in my spiritual life, but that he's everywhere. And you can not only see him within other discourses, but all things are pointing to God. And so this vision that the all of creation is participating in God, again, that's a word that folks in that movement would use to say, on the one hand, God is, infinitely qualitative different than creation, but yet near to. So participation is a word that in the Greek tradition was used to articulate that in a way that suspended both kind of dualism and pantheism, like we talked about at the very beginning. And so kind of finding ways to get this out into broader spheres, into the church. Whether people are interested, I'm not sure. But
so is there anything ongoing that people can be
we
look out for?
have a website, but it's under construction right now. So
Okay.
when that comes up, I'll let you know. And I don't know if you can link it to this. And yeah, so myself and the executive director, Aaron Jeffrey, are we're both literally in transition in our life, and at the same time COVID hit. So we are just making sure that we have our ducks in a row to get the website back up in a very clear and substantial way. And once that goes, I'll let you know.
Awesome. Well, I know we're running out of time, so I'll let you go here. But I really appreciate your time, and thanks for being so generous with it. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Your friendship is very meaningful. You know, we've talked twice before this, and I appreciate it. It's good to kind of do this. I've been in the middle of a move right now, living right now in Pennsylvania. I'm heading out west, and it's good to get involved, to have an academic conversation. I don't feel like I've had one for a little while. I have them more along the lines of cultural spheres and Christianity a lot right now, but to have a full blown kind of like academic conversation is a nice break for me. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, certainly, and hopefully we can continue the dialogue, and would love to see where you go from here.
Cool. Thank you so much, Michael.
All right. Well, take care.
Goodbye.
Bye.